Queen Victoria. The very name echoes through the grand halls of history, wrapped in layers of mystery, majesty, and meticulous ritual. When most people think of her, they imagine a stern-faced woman draped in black, seated stiffly upon a gilded throne, staring unflinchingly into the camera lens of early photography. She looks formidable, almost unapproachable, her expression unreadable, her presence imposing. Her iconic portrait has been etched into everything from postage stamps to statues, from history textbooks to cinematic adaptations. But beyond that solemn face and the heavy velvet gowns she often wore, Queen Victoria was more than just the symbol of an empire upon which the sun never set. She was a woman of peculiar habits, deeply rooted routines, and a surprising personal life that few ever dared to explore. Reigning for over 6 decades, from 1837 to 1901, she oversaw a period of tremendous change: the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the British Empire, major scientific breakthroughs, and the rise of modern Victorian society. Under her rule, Britain's global influence soared, yet at home, her personal life remained cloaked in privacy, guarded by palace walls and centuries-old protocols. One might assume that such a powerful monarch would live a life of absolute luxury and modern comforts. After all, she ruled over millions, and had access to the best doctors, the finest textiles, and the most sophisticated etiquette of her time. And yet, some of her habits, particularly those involving cleanliness and bathing, were surprisingly modest, even by the standards of ordinary people of her era. It's easy to forget that Queen Victoria lived in a time when ideas of hygiene were vastly different from what we know today. Daily showers were not the norm, plumbing was rudimentary, and the connection between germs and disease was still being uncovered. But still, we might expect that the Queen of England, Empress of India, and a woman known for her obsession with control and propriety, would have a strict and perhaps even extravagant bathing schedule. In truth, her relationship with cleanliness, and bathing in particular, was far more complicated and even contradictory. It's not uncommon to imagine royalty lounging in grand marble tubs, attended by servants pouring rose-scented water and scrubbing every inch with soft cloths imported from the Far East. But Queen Victoria's own bathing habits might just leave modern readers scratching their heads, not out of judgment, but out of pure curiosity. In a world today obsessed with scented shampoos, organic soaps and multi-step skincare routines, Queen Victoria's bathing schedule reflects not just the limitations of the time, but a unique and very human side of a woman who was often seen as something more than human, a pillar of state, a living symbol of an empire's pride. This story, oddly enough, begins not with scandal or luxury, but with routine, the quiet, unspoken rituals of cleanliness in the 1800s. Victoria's attitude toward bathing reflected a careful balance between modesty, medical advice, and the slow evolution of public hygiene awareness. While she had access to some of the best resources of the time, she lived through an era when most households, even wealthy ones, didn't have indoor bathrooms, and baths were often reserved for special occasions or ailments, rather than daily habit. So when we talk about Queen Victoria's bathing schedule, when we peek behind the royal curtain and examine the wash basins, pitchers and hip baths of her personal chambers, we find not decadence but restraint. We find that even the most powerful woman in the world lived in a time when water was drawn by hand, heated with effort, and poured into small tubs for brief, practical cleansing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't perfumed or luxurious in the way we might imagine, but it was deeply symbolic, because, for Queen Victoria, bathing was more than just a physical act. It was a moment of vulnerability, a practice shaped by class, belief, medical opinion, and an unshakable sense of duty to appear dignified at all times. In her diaries, which were extensive and detailed, Queen Victoria sometimes mentioned her health, her daily routines, and the advice of her doctors. While she rarely spoke directly about bathing, perhaps considering it too private to detail, historians have pieced together a fascinating portrait of her personal hygiene habits. And it is from these subtle records, cross-referenced with the habits of her household and era, that we begin to unravel the mystery. Just how often did Queen Victoria bathe? And more importantly, how did her cleanliness rituals compare to those of the people she ruled, both rich and poor? In this journey through candlelit corridors and steamy bath chambers, we'll not only discover the frequency of Queen Victoria's baths, but also the attitudes that shaped them. We'll explore how medicine, class, and gender all played a role in determining when, where, and how a royal body was cleansed. And along the way we may find that Queen Victoria, the powerful, distant figure we know from statues and coins, was, in some ways, not so different from the everyday woman of the Victorian era. She was after all a creature of her time, bound by the same customs and superstitions, limited by the same technologies, and guided by the same delicate balance of privacy and propriety. So, prepare to be surprised. Because while Queen Victoria's face may seem severe and untouchable in those sepia-toned portraits, her bathing habits tell a different story. A story not of excess or indulgence, but of simple routines, practical choices, and a quiet adherence to a very different definition of cleanliness. Her bathing schedule, far from being a royal oddity, is a window into the complex intersection of hygiene, health, and heritage. It may shock you, not because it's scandalous, but because it's so surprisingly ordinary. This is not the tale of a queen surrounded by bubbles and perfume. It's the story of a monarch navigating the expectations of an empire, while also managing the challenges of everyday bodily care, in a time before showers, plumbing, and modern hygiene standards. It's a reminder that behind every grand title lies a human being, one who, just like the rest of us, had to figure out how to stay clean in a world that was still learning what cleanliness meant. It is one of history's great paradoxes. Queen Victoria, a monarch so deeply associated with the past, reigned during one of the most explosively modernizing periods in human history. When she ascended the throne in 1837, England was still largely rural, lit by candlelight, and moved at the pace of horse-drawn carriages. But by the time of her death in 1901, the world had changed beyond recognition. It was an age of breathtaking innovation. Steam engines thundered across the countryside, iron tracks stitched cities together, factories filled the air with smoke, and the streets with workers, and telegrams flashed messages across oceans in seconds. Electricity began to hum through wires, lighting streets and homes where once only oil lamps had flickered. Trains connected villages to bustling metropolises. Even the invention of photography, that strange and wonderful new art, allowed her image to be captured, reproduced, and distributed across the empire, turning her into an icon recognized on every continent. The Victorian era wasn't just a royal period, it was a technological revolution. And yet, amidst all this dramatic transformation, there remained certain spheres of life that were curiously untouched by modernity, chief among them, the most intimate personal habits. The contrast was stark. Here was an empire leaping into the future, embracing machines, sciences, and exploration, and yet, in the private rooms of the palace, the queen still bathed in a small portable tub, filled bucket by bucket, just as her ancestors had done for centuries. One might expect that a ruler so closely associated with an age of innovation would have enjoyed the latest advancements in plumbing, hygiene, and sanitation. But surprisingly, Queen Victoria's personal routine remained deeply rooted in tradition, and in many ways, shockingly behind the times. It's a curious thing, this dissonance between the public image and private reality. On the world stage, Victoria stood as a symbol of progress. Under her rule, Britain became the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. Her ministers introduced sweeping social reforms, her navy ruled the seas. Her empire, so vast and sprawling, encompassed lands and cultures far beyond her own. It was a time of great pride, discovery, and development. Yet when the Queen retired to her private quarters at night, she entered a world still governed by 18th century customs and outdated domestic practices. The royal household, with all its grandeur, was a paradox, magnificent but old-fashioned, efficient yet ritual-bound, powerful but curiously resistant to change, especially in the realm of personal hygiene. This wasn't entirely Victoria's fault. After all, the understanding of cleanliness and health was still in its infancy. The germ theory of disease, now fundamental to medicine, didn't gain widespread acceptance until the latter half of her reign. Before then, many believed that illness came from bad air, the infamous miasma, and that bathing too often could weaken the body, or even invite disease by opening the pores. Doctors, even royal physicians, sometimes advised against frequent washing. Cleanliness to them was not necessarily about water and soap, but about avoiding chill or maintaining balance in bodily humours. In this light, Queen Victoria's resistance to more frequent bathing wasn't backwardness, it was prudence, informed by the leading medical advice of her time. And so, even as gaslights glowed in London streets and electric buzzers rang in palace corridors, the Queen's bathing routine remained tethered to an older rhythm. Baths were taken sparingly, weekly or less, and more often for medicinal purposes than for pleasure. Warm water had to be fetched manually, poured into copper-lined tubs and then laboriously emptied. The process was neither convenient nor quick. Unlike the piped-in plumbing of modern homes, The bathrooms of the Victorian elite were spaces of orchestration, requiring servants, preparation, and care. For Queen Victoria, this meant that a simple bath was a small production, with multiple ladies-in-waiting assisting with the process, all under the veil of royal modesty and strict propriety. Victoria was a woman of deep routine and precise habits. Though she was deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert, a man known for his own sense of hygiene and order, her daily rituals, including those involving cleanliness, were not dictated by affection or indulgence, but by decorum and duty. Modesty was paramount. In fact, she often bathed behind a screen or insisted that no one, not even her closest attendants, witness her undressed. While there were indoor toilets and rudimentary plumbing installed in some parts of the royal residences by the late 1800s, the full embrace of modern bathrooms came slowly, and Queen Victoria, already set in her ways, did not rush to embrace these conveniences. She remained suspicious of newfangled luxuries, preferring the predictability and safety of what she already knew. But here's where it becomes even more fascinating. Despite the modern advancements at her fingertips, gas lighting, telegraphs, and even early elevators in royal households, Queen Victoria's lifestyle in many ways mirrored that of the middle class or even the upper working class when it came to bathing. For all her status and wealth, her hygiene habits were not so different from the people she ruled. Most Britons of her time bathed once a week at most, if at all. Water was expensive to heat, indoor plumbing was rare, and for the poor, public bathhouses were the only option, if they were lucky. For many, a full body wash meant sitting in a tin tub in front of the fireplace, or simply washing with a damp cloth and basin, what was commonly known as a sponge bath. Victoria's world was one in transition. She lived in a palace equipped with gas lamps, and later electricity, yet still relied on footmen to bring hot water. She communicated across continents via telegram, yet maintained ancient traditions of court dress and etiquette, and most ironically, she presided over a society that was beginning to explore the idea of health through cleanliness, yet personally held back from the very routines we now consider essential to well-being. Her own children, particularly Prince Albert Edward, later King Edward VII, would later adopt more modern bathing habits, aligning themselves with the growing middle-class emphasis on hygiene. But Victoria, ever bound to her sense of Victorian modesty and restraint, remained loyal to the customs she had known since childhood. In many ways, Queen Victoria was both a product and a prisoner of her age. The world around her had begun to sprint, but she still walked at the pace of tradition. She ruled an empire that brought innovations to every corner of the globe. Yet in the privacy of her royal chambers, she remained tethered to an era where water was drawn by hand, and bathing was a chore, not a delight. The juxtaposition is startling. It forces us to reconsider what it meant to be modern in the 19th century. Progress, after all, is not always linear. It does not enter every room at once. Sometimes, even as cities glow with electric lights, the most personal aspects of life, like how often a queen bathes, remain cloaked in the shadows of the past. And so, while newspapers raved about the marvels of steamships and factories, and while the British public marvelled at the first photographs of distant lands, Queen Victoria continued her routine as she always had. She took her baths quietly, occasionally, and with great care to preserve her modesty. Her personal attendants, bound by courtly discretion, rarely recorded the specifics, but we know enough to understand that bathing was not a daily ritual. It was not even a weekly certainty. It was done when necessary, for health or for ceremony, and always within the tightly held framework of royal decorum. To modern eyes, this may seem unhygienic, even shocking. How could the Queen of England, a woman living in the height of empire and surrounded by innovation, not bathe every day? But to judge her by today's standards is to miss the point entirely. Queen Victoria's bathing habits were not strange for her time, they were entirely normal. What is remarkable is not how rarely she bathed, but how consistent she remained in her private life, even as the world outside her palace windows transformed at breakneck speed. In the end, Queen Victoria stands as a figure suspended between two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the candle and the electric bulb, the basin and the bathtub. Her reign marked the birth of a new world, yet her own habits often reflected the fading rhythms of the old. She is a reminder that history does not always move in unison. Sometimes it gallops forward in some places, while quietly lingering in others. Her bathing schedule, seemingly mundane, becomes a metaphor for this duality, a fascinating insight into a queen who ruled the future, but lived, in many ways, in the past. And perhaps that is what makes her story so compelling. Not the fact that she bathed infrequently, but that she did so while surrounded by the very forces that would soon redefine the meaning of modern life. In a time of engines, telegraphs, and industrial might, Queen Victoria remained a figure of ritual, of restraint, and of habits that defied the speed of change. Her bathing schedule may shock us, but only because it reveals how human, how ordinary, and how wonderfully complex this extraordinary monarch truly was. To understand Queen Victoria's unusual bathing habits, and why they might seem shocking to us today, we must step into the broader world of the 1800s and examine how people of that time viewed cleanliness. Because what we now see as essential for health and well-being, daily showers, frequent hand-washing, antibacterial soaps, and gleaming tiled bathrooms, were once matters of suspicion, discomfort, or outright fear. The Victorian era was a curious mix of advancement and ignorance, especially when it came to hygiene. Science and superstition existed side by side, and nowhere was this more evident than in the way people approached personal cleanliness. In the early to mid-1800s, cleanliness was not universally equated with health. In fact, for much of the century, the very idea that water could cleanse the body of disease was still up for debate. Many believed the opposite, that water, especially warm or cold in certain contexts, could be dangerous. It was widely thought that bathing too frequently could weaken the immune system, leave the skin vulnerable, or even introduce illness. Physicians of the time argued over the benefits and dangers of water exposure, offering conflicting advice to both the rich and poor. Medical journals debated whether daily washing promoted health or invited death. Even some royal doctors hesitated to encourage regular bathing for fear it might open the pores and let in harmful air or miasma, which was considered the source of many illnesses. This belief in miasma, the idea that foul smells or bad air caused disease, shaped much of Victorian society's approach to cleanliness. Streets were scrubbed not for sanitation, but to reduce the stench. Perfumes and scented oils were used to mask odors, not necessarily to cleanse, and people were more concerned about smelling clean than being clean by modern standards. Queen Victoria herself, like many of her subjects, would have grown up in a world where the nose, not science, was the primary judge of hygiene. If something smelled fresh, it was believed to be healthy. If it stank, it was dangerous. But bathing the body too often, even in fresh water, was considered a risky endeavor, one best done cautiously, sparingly, and often only when one was already ill. Baths, when taken, were often viewed as a form of treatment rather than routine self-care. Hot baths were prescribed for certain ailments, cold baths for others. Some doctors recommended partial bathing, washing only specific parts of the body, while others insisted on dry washing, using cloths and powders rather than water. Full immersion was not common, nor considered necessary. In fact, many people believed that the skin had protective oils that should not be stripped away too often. The idea that daily soap and water washing might promote health was a radical one, slowly emerging alongside scientific discoveries about bacteria and disease, discoveries that many resisted for years. The average Victorian household, particularly outside the wealthiest classes, lacked access to proper bathing facility altogether. Most homes did not have running water, let alone bathrooms. People fetched water by the bucket from pumps or wells, and heating it required time and fuel, both costly resources. As a result, many families bathed only once a week, often sharing the same water, starting with the head of the household and ending with the youngest child. This was not seen as unhygienic, but as practical. Daily bathing, in contrast, would have seemed wasteful, unnecessary, and even strange. In this context, Queen Victoria's infrequent bathing was not unusual. In fact, it aligned with the accepted norms of her time. Even within the royal household, the act of bathing was elaborate, time-consuming, and highly ritualized. A bath for the Queen required preparation from her attendants, carrying heated water up multiple flights of stairs, preparing the tub, ensuring privacy, and then repeating the entire process in reverse to clean up. It was far from a casual event. Baths were drawn carefully and used conservatively. For this reason, many Victorians, including royalty, opted instead for sponge baths or dry baths using cloths, perfumes and powders to maintain the appearance of cleanliness without the complications of a full soak. These practices were often considered sufficient unless the individual was unwell, particularly dirty from travel, or about to attend a major event. Even then, modesty prevailed. Women often bathed in shifts or behind screens, never fully undressed in front of anyone, not even close servants. Queen Victoria, known for her modesty and adherence to propriety, certainly followed these customs. Soap, too, was not the staple household item we know today. Early in the 19th century, it was expensive and heavily perfumed, often reserved for washing clothes or linens rather than bodies. When used on skin, it was typically harsh and drying. Only with later developments in manufacturing and chemistry did milder, more affordable soaps become widely available. But by that time, Queen Victoria was already set in her ways, her bathing routines long established and unlikely to change, simply because the world around her had begun to embrace new products or standards. She remained faithful to the traditions and beliefs that had shaped her youth, even as new knowledge challenged them. Interestingly, the link between cleanliness and morality became more pronounced during Victoria's reign, but not necessarily in the way we might assume. Cleanliness was often seen as a virtue, but primarily in symbolic or social terms. A clean child was a well-behaved child. A clean woman was a modest woman. A clean home reflected good moral values. Yet this notion of cleanliness still did not necessarily mean frequent bathing. Instead, it emphasized appearance, smell, and composure. Clean clothes, combed hair, and well-polished shoes mattered more than whether one had washed behind the ears that morning. For Queen Victoria, who was deeply religious and upheld traditional values, this framework of cleanliness fit naturally with her worldview. She valued order, decency, and modesty, and her bathing habits reflected those principles. At the heart of Victorian cleanliness, then, was a delicate dance between public presentation and private practice. People were expected to look clean, act clean, and smell clean, but the path to achieving that was not what we would recognize today. Instead of daily showers, they relied on layers of clothing to protect against dirt, strategic washing of hands and faces, and the occasional bath when time, resources, or necessity permitted. It was a world where water was both revered and feared, where medicine had not yet caught up with microbes, and where tradition held more weight than science. All of this helps us better understand why Queen Victoria's bathing schedule, infrequent and cautious, was entirely normal for her day. It was not laziness or neglect. It was not due to a lack of access or resources. Rather, it reflected the prevailing wisdom of the time, that the body was delicate, that water could both cleanse and corrupt, and that modesty and ritual were more important than regular rinsing. Even as public bathhouses began to spread, and even as new plumbing technologies entered elite homes, old beliefs died hard. For the Queen, there was little reason to change what had always worked, and even less reason to abandon customs that upheld dignity, routine, and tradition. And in truth, she was not alone. Her contemporaries, from nobility to middle-class homemakers, often shared the same habits and held the same fears. They too questioned the safety of cold water, avoided drafts after bathing, and viewed bodily exposure as something to be minimized at all costs. When we reflect on this today, it gives us a new perspective, not only on Queen Victoria's life, but on the entire Victorian age. It was a time of innovation on the outside and deep conservatism on the inside. It was a time when trains crossed countries, yet many feared the common bath. A time when gaslights lit up opera houses, but warm water was still poured from kettles into small copper tubs. So, when we say Queen Victoria's bathing schedule will shock you, what we're really uncovering is not just a personal quirk, but a window into the cautious, complex, and contradictory world of the 19th century. A world still clinging to old ideas of cleanliness, while unknowingly stepping into the dawn of modern hygiene. A world where the Queen, for all her grandeur, still bathed like the rest, cautiously, occasionally, and with deep respect for the traditions that shaped her from the very start. When one thinks of a royal queen, especially one like Queen Victoria, who ruled over the grandest empire of her time, it's easy to imagine scenes of unimaginable luxury, a steaming marble bath, scented with the oils of foreign flowers brought in from the corners of the British Empire, attendants, in pressed uniforms standing by with plush towels, soaps handcrafted from rare spices and milk, perhaps even perfumed steam rising from golden basins, while string music wafts softly through velvet-draped halls. After all, she was Queen Victoria, Empress of India, ruler of a global superpower, sovereign to millions. Wouldn't such a woman have access to the most extravagant personal care routines available in the 19th century? To the modern imagination, royalty is synonymous with excess, especially in matters of comfort and grooming. In a world where celebrities enjoy private spas and designer skincare, we assume that royalty, especially Victorian royalty, enjoyed the same privileges, perhaps even grander ones. And yet, reality tells a much more surprising story. What people today might expect from a queen's hygiene routine, frequent, fragrant, and fabulous, was in fact almost the opposite of how Queen Victoria lived. While today's standards equate cleanliness with sophistication, in Queen Victoria's time, the idea of daily baths and luxurious skincare products was not only uncommon, it was sometimes viewed as strange or even dangerous. Despite being surrounded by wealth, opulence, and access to global goods, the Queen's own hygiene habits were shaped less by luxury and more by tradition, medical advice, and the cultural norms of her era. And that's precisely what makes her bathing schedule so fascinating. Far from being soaked in perfumed water each evening, Queen Victoria's hygiene rituals were modest, cautious, and surprisingly old-fashioned. To understand why, we must step back into the lavish yet paradoxically restrained world of the royal court. It's true that the palaces were magnificent. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, each one a sprawling testament to Britain's power and Victoria's reign. Gilded chandeliers, velvet upholstery, imported tapestries, and grand staircases defined these spaces. And yet, behind all that splendor, there was something oddly simple about the Queen's personal quarters, particularly when it came to cleanliness. There were no built-in marble bathtubs, no modern plumbing as we know it, no gleaming tiled wet rooms. Even when the first primitive bathrooms were introduced, they were rarely used as we use them today. Water still had to be carried by hand, and bathing was often reserved for specific occasions rather than as part of a daily ritual. Soap, too, was not the indulgent, scented bar we might imagine. In the early 1800s, soap was often harsh, heavily lye-based, and primarily used for laundry. Even when milder varieties began to emerge, thanks to industrial innovations and increasing trade, they were expensive and still lacked the lush, fragrant experience we now associate with personal care. Queen Victoria certainly had access to the best available products of her time, but she didn't necessarily use them lavishly. In fact, records and anecdotal evidence suggest that she bathed infrequently and sparingly, and the products she used were practical, rather than indulgent. Her routines were shaped more by modesty and efficiency than by luxury. The Queen's personal sensibilities also played a role. Victoria was famously modest, deeply private, sometimes even prudish by modern standards. She viewed her body as something not to be flaunted or overly indulged. Even in the presence of her closest attendants, she often insisted on privacy during bathing. Full nudity, even among female servants, was rare and discouraged. She would often bathe behind a curtain or screen, or insist that attendants stay only as long as absolutely necessary. For Queen Victoria, bathing was not a moment of pampered luxury, but rather a task, necessary, but not central to one's daily comfort. It was approached with the same seriousness and restraint that she brought to so many aspects of her life. And while the public might assume that a queen would bathe every day, surrounded by scented waters and soft linens, the truth was that she bathed only occasionally, weekly at most, and sometimes less often than that. This wasn't laziness, nor was it due to a lack of facilities. Rather, it was a reflection of prevailing beliefs at the time. Doctors warned against the dangers of frequent bathing, suggesting that too much water exposure might weaken the body or invite illness. Medical journals advised against opening the pores too often, and warm water was sometimes thought to destabilize one's inner constitution. Cold water, on the other hand, was seen as invigorating, but risky for women, whose bodies were considered more delicate. It's little wonder, then, that Queen Victoria's hygiene schedule was as restrained as it was. Yet despite this, the Queen's image was never associated with poor hygiene. Quite the opposite. She was seen as the picture of discipline, order, and moral uprightness. Cleanliness, in the Victorian mind, was less about scrubbing away bacteria, which they did not fully understand, and more about appearing presentable, modest, and dignified. It was about wearing clean clothes, brushing one's hair, and carrying oneself with composure. A woman, especially one of high station, could be considered entirely clean without having bathed for a week, or even longer, so long as she looked the part. Queen Victoria understood this image-making deeply. Her role as monarch required a careful balance between human vulnerability and regal poise, and her bathing habits reflected this tension. Indeed, while she rarely indulged in the kind of luxurious baths we might picture, Victoria did make use of the occasional medicinal soak, particularly when advised by doctors. These were often taken in specially prepared tubs, sometimes with added salts or oils, but not as a form of relaxation. Instead, they were seen as treatments, remedies for aches, fatigue, or minor ailments. These medicinal baths were taken seriously, but still only occasionally. The Queen didn't have the modern luxury of a spa day, or a rejuvenating soak after a long court appearance. Her schedule was rigid, her health monitored closely, and any deviation from routine had to be medically justified or carefully controlled. And even then, full immersion in water was rare. Sponge baths were far more common, discreetly administered with warm water and soft cloths by trusted maids. Even within the royal family, there was a spectrum of hygiene preferences. Her husband, Prince Albert, who was of German descent and more progressive in his views, was reportedly more particular about cleanliness and encouraged improvements in the royal household's water systems. After his death, however, Victoria's habits became even more conservative. She leaned on routine, resisted change, and surrounded herself with familiar customs. In her mourning, she doubled down on modesty and ritual, and personal indulgence, like luxurious bathing, fell even further from favor. Her loyalty to the past became stronger than her curiosity about the future, especially in matters that touched the body or required vulnerability. Still, Victoria's reign coincided with a broader cultural shift. By the end of the 19th century, indoor plumbing began to spread among the upper classes. Soap became more refined, and ideas about public health started to incorporate better hygiene practices. Queen Victoria's own children and grandchildren grew up in a more modern world, one where regular bathing became more acceptable and even encouraged. But Victoria herself remained steadfast in her old ways. While the empire modernized and the world changed, she kept her routines as they had always been: predictable, reserved, and grounded in her deep sense of propriety. To those of us living in the 21st century, this may seem unbelievable. How could a queen, surrounded by luxury, wealth, and power, not indulge in the comfort of a daily bath? How could someone who ruled over nations and commanded armies maintain a hygiene schedule that today might raise eyebrows? But therein lies the shock and the lesson. Queen Victoria's bathing habits were not lacking in cleanliness by the standards of her time. Rather, they were a reflection of a world still learning, still discovering, and still caught between superstition and science. Hers was a world where bathing was meaningful, private, and sparingly practiced, not a daily ritual of comfort, but an occasional necessity, framed by modesty and medical caution. And perhaps that's what makes her so fascinating. She ruled an empire that was rapidly embracing modernity, yet in the most personal aspects of her life, she remained a woman of an older time. Her bathing schedule reminds us that royalty does not always mean indulgence, and that power often resides alongside surprising restraint. Queen Victoria may have been the most powerful woman of her age, but when it came to hygiene, she was also one of its most curious contradictions. A sovereign in a palace, bathing like a commoner, and that simple, humbling truth might just be the most unexpected part of all. Despite sitting on the throne during one of the most transformative centuries in human history, Queen Victoria herself held on to surprisingly traditional habits, especially when it came to cleanliness. While the world around her roared forward with trains, telegraphs, and scientific discoveries, the Queen's personal hygiene routine remained firmly rooted in the practices of an earlier time. And if you imagined her enjoying long, scented baths in marble tubs, attended by a team of ladies-in-waiting, you'd be quite far from the truth. In reality, Queen Victoria, the matriarch of a global empire, bathed only once a week, and sometimes not even that often. Her approach to cleanliness was shaped as much by the beliefs of her time as by her own personality, and the routine that emerged was far from what many modern readers might expect from a queen. In fact, most days, Queen Victoria did not step into a bathtub at all. Instead, she was what we might now call spot cleaned. Her daily washing typically consisted of being gently sponged off by her personal maid, who would use warm water and soft cloths to clean the Queen's body. This was done while she remained in her dressing gown or undergarments, seated in her private quarters. These sponge baths were considered sufficient, and even proper, for a woman of her station, and full immersion in a bath was reserved for only the most necessary occasions. The Queen reportedly disliked getting wet, and found full baths to be something of a chore. This belief wasn't unusual for the time. In fact, many Victorians, especially those from the upper class, believed that excessive bathing could weaken the body, or even invite illness. This once-a-week bath, when it did happen, was no luxurious soak in rose petals and lavender oils. Her bathing facilities were modest compared to modern standards, even if elegant in appearance. The water would be drawn by servants and heated manually. There were no instant taps or thermostats. The Queen would step into a large but simple tub, and the process was efficient rather than indulgent. There are even anecdotes from palace staff that the Queen often wanted the bath to be done quickly, never lingering in the water longer than necessary. And while she certainly had access to soaps and oils, these were often plain, medicinal, or floral in scent, not the luxurious blends one might imagine for a monarch. Cleanliness, in her view, was practical, not pleasurable. It's also important to understand that Queen Victoria's bathing habits were a reflection of the medical and cultural norms of the time. Even among the elite, the idea of daily bathing was rare, and washing too frequently was seen by some doctors as risky. The pores, they believed, could absorb disease, especially if water was cold or the body was tired. Women in particular were advised to avoid excessive exposure to water, especially during their menstrual cycles or pregnancy. As a result, hygiene was often maintained through a combination of sponge baths, fresh linens, and generous amounts of perfume or floral water to mask any lingering body odor. In Queen Victoria's case, records indicate that she was particularly fond of lavender water and citrus-based scents, which she often applied to her handkerchiefs and clothing. Her bathing routine also reflected the deep layers of formality and modesty that defined Victorian aristocracy. Even in her private quarters, there was an elaborate system of propriety and privacy. She was never truly alone. Her personal maid, who often knew her better than most of her ministers, attended to these intimate routines with discretion and skill. Everything was choreographed, respectful, and careful. The Queen's own sense of dignity and decorum meant that her body was not to be exposed unnecessarily, not even to herself. Mirrors were minimal, and self-examination was discouraged. The process of getting clean was not an exercise in luxury or leisure, but rather a quiet, almost invisible duty in the background of royal life. Over time, Queen Victoria's aging body required even more assistance. In her later years, when arthritis and weight gain limited her movement, her maids would perform much of the washing for her. Still, the weekly bath remained the maximum, not the minimum, expectation, and in times of illness, mourning, or heavy political responsibility, even that might be postponed. It's worth remembering that Queen Victoria spent decades in mourning attire after the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. During these years, she withdrew further into a personal world of routine and ritual, where comfort mattered more than fashion, and simplicity trumped extravagance. Her hygiene habits, already modest, became even more subdued. And yet, in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, she continued to embody the stern, disciplined image that came to define her reign. Interestingly, Queen Victoria's aversion to frequent bathing did not stop her from caring deeply about cleanliness in a broader sense. She was known to insist that her linens be changed daily and her gowns brushed regularly. The palaces she inhabited were kept to high standards of order and tidiness, at least by 19th century standards. She expected her children and grandchildren to behave with similar attention to cleanliness, though she did not necessarily encourage them to bathe more often than she did. In her personal writings and letters, there is little discussion of bathing or cleanliness in an emotional or sensory sense. It was, instead, another duty, one that belonged in the background, rarely spoken of, quietly handled. To the modern mind, a once-a-week bath, or even less, may seem astonishing, especially when we consider her status and resources. But in the 1800s, this was far from unusual, even for royalty. Cleanliness was viewed more as a matter of presentation and discipline than of hygiene and health. The body was something to be managed, not celebrated. There were no Instagram skincare routines, no scented candles by the tub, no plush white robes. For Queen Victoria, the act of bathing was like much of her reign, restrained, efficient, and defined by the values of an older world. It's also revealing to compare her habits with the broader trends of her time. Indoor plumbing was just beginning to spread through England, and most homes, even upper-class ones, still relied on chamber pots and wash basins. Hot water was a luxury, and bathing required effort. In that context, her weekly bath, accompanied by daily sponging, was relatively advanced. After all, many common people in Victorian England bathed monthly or seasonally. Access to water, privacy, and warmth made all the difference. The Queen's routine may seem limited by today's standards, but it was, in many ways, the best her world could offer. In truth, Queen Victoria's bathing habits are a fascinating lens through which to view her life and her era. They reveal not only the limits of 19th century science and plumbing, but also the complex interplay between class, culture, and personal belief. They show how even the most powerful individuals are shaped by the norms of their time, and how cleanliness, something we take for granted today, was once a matter of deep uncertainty and debate. And perhaps most surprisingly, they remind us that behind the velvet curtains and golden thrones royalty is still human. Queen Victoria may have ruled an empire, but when it came to her daily bath, she was a woman of habit, restraint, and surprising simplicity. So the next time you imagine royal life as a swirl of indulgent pampering and constant luxury, think again. Queen Victoria's bathing schedule, with its sponge baths and once-a-week immersions, was not only a product of its time, it was a reminder that true regality, in her view, lay not in extravagance, but in discipline. And in that discipline, even something as mundane as a bath becomes a symbol of an era, quietly shocking, deeply human, and endlessly fascinating. Interestingly, Queen Victoria's aversion to frequent bathing did not stop her from caring deeply about cleanliness in a broader sense. She was known to insist that her linens be changed daily, and her gowns brushed regularly. The palaces she inhabited were kept to high standards of order and tidiness, at least by 19th century standards. She expected her children and grandchildren to behave with similar attention to cleanliness, though she did not necessarily encourage them to bathe more often than she did. In her personal writings and letters, there is little discussion of bathing or cleanliness, in an emotional or sensory sense. It was, instead, another duty, one that belonged in the background, rarely spoken of, quietly handled. To the modern mind, a once-a-week bath, or even less, may seem astonishing, especially when we consider her status and resources, but in the 1800s, this was far from unusual, even for royalty. Cleanliness was viewed more as a matter of presentation and discipline than of hygiene and health. The body was something to be managed, not celebrated. There were no Instagram skincare routines, no scented candles by the tub, no plush white robes. For Queen Victoria, the act of bathing was like much of her reign, restrained, efficient, and defined by the values of an older world. It's also revealing to compare her habits with the broader trends of her time. Indoor plumbing was just beginning to spread through England, and most homes, even upper-class ones, still relied on chamber pots and wash basins. Hot water was a luxury and bathing required effort. In that context, her weekly bath, accompanied by daily sponging, was relatively advanced. After all, many common people in Victorian England bathed monthly, or seasonally. Access to water, privacy, and warmth made all the difference. The Queen's routine may seem limited by today's standards, but it was, in many ways, the best her world could offer. In truth, Queen Victoria's bathing habits are a fascinating lens through which to view her life and her era. They reveal not only the limits of 19th century science and plumbing, but also the complex interplay between class, culture, and personal belief. They show how even the most powerful individuals are shaped by the norms of their time, and how cleanliness, something we take for granted today, was once a matter of deep uncertainty and debate. And perhaps most surprisingly, they remind us that behind the velvet curtains and golden thrones, royalty is still human. Queen Victoria may have ruled an empire, but when it came to her daily bath, she was a woman of habit, restraint, and surprising simplicity. So the next time you imagine royal life as a swirl of indulgent pampering and constant luxury, think again. Queen Victoria's bathing schedule, with its sponge baths and once-a-week immersions, was not only a product of its time, it was a reminder that true regality, in her view, lay not in extravagance, but in discipline. And in that discipline, even something as mundane as a bath becomes a symbol of an era, quietly shocking, deeply human, and endlessly fascinating. To understand why Queen Victoria, one of the most influential and visible monarchs in modern history, bathed so infrequently, we must first step back into the mindset of the 19th century, a time when the world was rapidly advancing in technology and empire, yet clinging firmly to older traditions when it came to personal hygiene. It's tempting for modern readers to impose today's cleanliness standards on historical figures, expecting daily showers, perfumed soaps, and luxurious bathtubs. But Queen Victoria, though emblematic of modern empire and progress, was also a deeply traditional woman raised in an era where frequent bathing was not just rare, it was suspicious. The reasons she bathed so rarely weren't laziness or lack of access. They were rooted in deep cultural beliefs, outdated medical theories, and even emotional vulnerabilities tied to privacy, modesty, and fear. In Victorian society, bathing was not yet understood as a routine act of health and cleanliness in the way we see it today. Instead, water itself was seen as potentially dangerous, especially cold water. The belief that water could carry disease was common, but not in the way we understand microbial transmission now. In many circles, it was thought that bathing, especially immersing the entire body in water, could disturb the body's delicate balance of humors, weaken one's immune system, or even open the pores to miasmas, or bad airs, thought to cause cholera and typhoid. Clean water wasn't always readily available in even the wealthiest palaces, and warm water had to be heated manually, bucket by bucket, carried by hand into large tubs. This process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, making full-body baths a grand event rather than a daily occurrence. For Queen Victoria, despite her wealth and status, bathing remained an infrequent activity simply because that was the norm, even for royalty. Cultural tradition played an enormous role in shaping her hygiene habits. Victoria was born in 1819 and grew up under the strict watch of her mother and the infamous Kensington system, a rigid, controlling structure designed to keep her isolated and obedient. She was not raised to see personal indulgence or sensual comforts, including the enjoyment of a warm bath, as priorities. Instead, duty, modesty, and propriety were instilled in her from a young age. As a result, even when she became queen, her deeply conservative values continued to guide her private routines. Bathing was seen not only as unnecessary but potentially inappropriate if done too often. For a woman of her status, there were expectations of grace and decorum, and immersing oneself in a tub, naked and vulnerable, even in private, could feel unsettling. Privacy itself was a complicated concept for the queen. Despite being the most visible woman in the empire, she had little true personal space. Her every move was documented, and even her most private moments, like bathing, were not entirely solitary. Victoria's relationship with her own body and modesty also influenced her bathing routine. The queen was known for her strong personal morals and discomfort with overt displays of the body. She gave birth to 9 children, but her writings suggest a persistent emotional conflict with sexuality, physicality, and vulnerability. Even the act of being bathed by a maid, which was more common than a solo bath, may have felt intrusive. The royal sponging ritual, which she often preferred, allowed her to be cleaned while still maintaining a degree of modesty and distance. She would remain partially clothed or covered, while her maid, often one of her most trusted attendants, gently wiped her down with warm scented water. It was a symbolic nod to hygiene without the exposure and immersion of a full bath. There were also lingering fears of illness and frailty that shaped her attitude toward water. Queen Victoria was deeply influenced by the medical community of her time, which was still deeply divided over the benefits and risks of bathing. Some doctors advocated for regular cleaning of the skin to prevent disease, but others warned that baths could open the pores and invite illness. Victoria herself had endured her share of health scares and was known to be deeply concerned for her own well-being. The death of her beloved Prince Albert in 1861, which left her in a state of permanent mourning, only deepened her anxieties. As she aged, her habits became even more conservative. Like many Victorians, she believed that the body's strength needed to be preserved, not challenged, and that indulging in too many modern habits, such as frequent bathing, could do more harm than good. Additionally, personal preference cannot be overlooked. Even with her status and access, Queen Victoria simply did not see bathing as a pleasurable act. Unlike today's modern associations of baths with relaxation and self-care, for her, it was a necessary but rare chore, something to be done only when needed. It wasn't until the late Victorian period, when indoor plumbing became more common and scientific understanding of germs evolved, that bathing began to be seen as both healthy and essential. But by then, Victoria was set in her ways. Her court followed her lead, and many aristocrats continued to bathe infrequently. It was not until the Edwardian era, after her death, that hygiene standards began to shift significantly among the upper class. Her reluctance to bathe more frequently was also a matter of routine and resistance to change. Queen Victoria was famously stubborn and traditional, a woman of strong opinions and fixed habits. She kept the same personal attendants for decades, dressed in mourning black for 40 years after Albert's death, and preferred the familiar over the new. Altering her bathing habits would have required not just a physical adjustment, but a psychological one, a shift in how she saw her role, her body, and the world. In many ways, her infrequent bathing mirrored her emotional distance and stoicism, qualities that came to define her reign. Yet despite her limited personal bathing, Queen Victoria still valued cleanliness in a broader sense. Her clothing was changed frequently, and her linens were kept fresh. Her maids were instructed to keep her surroundings tidy, and her appearance pristine. Cleanliness was important, just not in the modern sense of daily showers and exfoliating scrubs. For Victoria, cleanliness was more symbolic than literal. It meant order, propriety, and control, not the removal of germs. It reflected a societal ideal more than a medical necessity. In the end, Queen Victoria's infrequent bathing was a complex mix of tradition, fear, modesty, and habit. It may surprise modern readers, even shock them, to learn that one of the most powerful women in the world may have gone weeks without immersing herself in water. But to judge her by today's standards is to miss the larger picture. Her bathing schedule tells us more than just a quirky detail of royal life. It offers a window into an era in transition, where the modern world was dawning, but the shadows of the past still lingered. She ruled over a century that saw trains, electricity, telegraphs, and empires, but in her personal chambers, time stood still, and the bath remained, quite literally, on the sidelines. While today we may step into sleek marble bathtubs with high-tech jets and lavender-scented bubbles, Queen Victoria's bathing setup was an entirely different affair, less glamorous, more utilitarian, and surprisingly rustic. In fact, despite her status as the Empress of India and queen of one of the world's most powerful empires, Victoria's bathtub would seem odd, even primitive by modern standards. It was not permanently affixed in a tiled bathroom, nor connected to a steady stream of running hot water. Instead, the Queen bathed in portable tubs, typically made of copper or porcelain, which were set up in whatever room was deemed convenient, often close to a fireplace or a source of warmth. Imagine the sight: the most powerful woman in the world sitting in a round copper tub, hastily filled with buckets of heated water, steam rising into the cold morning air of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Towels would be laid out nearby, often warmed over the hearth by attentive maids, ready to cocoon her body the moment she stepped out of the water. There were no tiled floors or ceramic soap dishes. Instead, the bathing ritual was surrounded by thick rugs, ornate screens for privacy, and velvet drapes that held back the chill of the British air. The bath itself wasn't what we might consider luxurious, not in the modern spa-like sense. It was practical, minimal, and certainly not daily. Victoria's tub was usually set in the middle of the room, not inside a bathroom, because bathrooms as we know them today were still a relatively new concept during the early years of her reign. In many royal residences, plumbing was an inconsistent convenience at best. Hot water had to be fetched from the kitchens or sculleries, carried in large jugs or copper kettles by housemaids and footmen, who would lug them up the stairs to the Queen's chambers. Once the tub was full, which took considerable time and effort, the bathing ritual could begin. And while one might imagine such an intimate moment to be solitary, Queen Victoria's baths were anything but private. Her attendants remained close, assisting her with undressing, scrubbing, drying, and even dressing again. A lady of such rank was never truly alone, even in her most vulnerable state. The bathtub itself was a curious piece of craftsmanship. Some were oval, others round, but all were deep and heavy, designed to retain heat as long as possible. Some tubs had wooden frames, others rested directly on the floor. They were lined with linen or towels to make the experience more comfortable. And after the bath, the water had to be emptied manually, again by servants, who would haul it away bucket by bucket. There was no such thing as a plug-and-drain system in most of these tubs. And unlike modern bathtubs that remain stationary and ready for use at any moment, these tubs were stored away between uses, only brought out when the Queen intended to bathe, which, as mentioned earlier, wasn't very often. In fact, the process was so laborious that it made sense for full baths to be rare. Despite this simplicity, the act of bathing was still surrounded by ritual and decorum. A screen was always set up to shield the Queen's body from view, though her most trusted maids were allowed behind it. Fragrant oils or rose water might occasionally be added to the bath, not so much for hygiene, but to offer a light scent, masking any unpleasant odors. Soap, when used, was usually made from natural fats and perfumed with herbs, lavender, sandalwood, or rose, but it was used sparingly, as frequent use was believed to dry the skin or even lead to illness. In colder months, the challenge wasn't just heating the water, but also heating the room. The grand halls of royal palaces were notoriously drafty. Even with a roaring fire, steam would evaporate quickly, leaving the Queen exposed to chilly air. That's why rugs and drapes played such an important role in these makeshift bathing spaces. They trapped the heat and gave a semblance of coziness in what were often cold, echoing stone rooms. The entire process required delicate timing. Water had to be poured in just before the Queen stepped in, so it wouldn't cool too quickly, and the towels had to be warmed at the precise moment to wrap her up in comfort after her bath. What's even more striking is the juxtaposition of this humble arrangement with the grandeur that surrounded it. While Victoria may have soaked in a copper tub in a candlelit room, outside those velvet drapes waited a world of unimaginable wealth: diamond tiaras, royal banquets, and dignitaries from every corner of the globe. Yet within the confines of her bathing space, the queen was more like a commoner than anyone would expect. She didn't recline in gilded bathtubs or indulge in luxury bubble baths. Her ritual was practical, routine, and deeply traditional, far removed from the indulgence we might assume royalty would afford themselves. Moreover, these bathing setups had to travel with her. Queen Victoria moved frequently between her royal residences, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, and Osborne House. At each location, a similar arrangement had to be recreated. Her preferred tubs and screens were packed, transported, and reset in whichever room she would use for bathing. The Queen's bathing environment was not a permanent fixture, but a movable experience that followed her wherever she went, further underlining how bathing in the 19th century was still a logistical operation, even for a monarch. Occasionally during her stays at Balmoral in Scotland or Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, her baths would take place in warmer, sunnier rooms, sometimes even near windows that allowed natural light to filter in. These were rare luxuries, and even then the ritual did not change much. Her sense of modesty, practicality, and adherence to routine kept the act of bathing simple and subdued. It's easy to imagine how different this all feels compared to the royal expectations of today. When we think of modern royalty, gleaming bathrooms, designer soaps, spa treatments, we often forget that less than 200 years ago, even the Queen of England bathed in a portable tub, by firelight, with steam rising into a cold chamber, while attendants scurried about trying to keep everything warm and decent. This contrast between appearance and reality is one of the most fascinating parts of Queen Victoria's life. On the outside, she was the face of empire, wearing grand gowns and glittering jewels, but behind palace doors, she followed rituals that were deeply rooted in an older, simpler world. The bathtub she used was never a symbol of luxury, but one of practicality. It reflected a world in transition, where society was racing toward industrialization, but personal routines remained tethered to the past. Plumbing was advancing, cities were electrifying, photography was capturing reality, but the Queen still bathed in a copper tub filled by hand. It's an image that is both humbling and oddly comforting. It reminds us that no matter how powerful someone may be, their daily routines are often shaped by the same limitations and traditions as everyone else. In the end, the story of Queen Victoria's bathtub is more than just about how she bathed. It's a window into the personal side of a monarch, so often remembered for her public persona. The stern face, the empire-spanning reign, the widow's black gown, all these tell one story. But her copper tub, her warmed towels, her Spartan bathing habits, they tell another. They reveal a woman who, despite the power she held, remained deeply rooted in the rhythms of her time, and perhaps even in the insecurities and customs of her upbringing. In her bathtub, Queen Victoria was not just a sovereign, she was a woman of habit, modesty, and restraint, surrounded by warmth and tradition, even in the most private of rituals. In Queen Victoria's day, the act of bathing, especially for someone of royal stature, was far removed from the brisk daily showers we consider ordinary today. For Her Majesty, the ritual of the royal bath was a slow, intricate, and deliberate process, one soaked not just in warm water, but in centuries of tradition, caution, and symbolism. It was less about scrubbing away the physical dirt of the body, and more about observing a long-established custom, performed almost ceremonially. Bathing was not undertaken lightly or frequently, but when it did occur, it was a significant production involving a small, trusted staff and careful preparation. The process would begin with the maid, usually a personal lady's maid, who was intimately familiar with the Queen's preferences. It was her job to oversee every detail, ensuring that the bath water was not too hot nor too cold, that the oils were chosen according to Her Majesty's tastes, and that privacy and propriety were preserved at all times. The water itself would be carried in heavy copper buckets, warmed in the kitchen, or a nearby fireplace and hauled upstairs by footmen or household staff, sometimes dozens of buckets just for a single bath. There was no plumbing to speak of in the early years of Victoria's reign, and even later, the idea of running water directly into a tub was more of a novelty than a norm in even the grandest of palaces. Each bucket had to be poured carefully into a freestanding tub, often made of copper or porcelain, placed in the center of a room, not a bathroom per se, but a space temporarily converted for the task. Surrounding the tub would be towels warmed by the fire, delicate lace-trimmed linens, and bowls of scented oils or herbal infusions like lavender, rose, or chamomile, designed more to mask body odor than cleanse the skin. The Queen would not bathe alone. While modesty was maintained to a degree, she would be assisted by her maid, who would help her undress, ensure the room was warm enough, and remain close by with sponges, cloths and lotions. The actual process of bathing often involved sitting or reclining, while the maid gently sponged her body, working quickly but respectfully. There was little of the vigorous scrubbing we associate with cleanliness today. Rather, it was a light dabbing, a ritualistic application of warm water and oils that comforted the body more than it truly sanitized it. Cleanliness was believed to be partially spiritual, connected with modesty, order, and class, rather than the complete removal of dirt or sweat. As such, the royal bath was not always about getting clean, but about maintaining the royal image of poise, routine and control. The queen might emerge from her bath, feeling refreshed in a ceremonial sense, but not necessarily scrubbed clean by modern standards. After the bath, she would be wrapped in thick, warmed towels and dressed again by her maid, often into new layers of petticoats, corsets and gowns. Her hair would be brushed out, perfumes applied sparingly, and perhaps a light meal or tea would follow. It was a process that could take an hour or more, orchestrated with precision and regularity, but spaced out by weeks. Unlike today, where hygiene is often driven by scientific understanding of germs and health, Queen Victoria's bathing rituals were governed more by tradition, social custom, and personal comfort. In this way, the royal bath was a fascinating blend of ancient habit and restrained luxury, a reminder that even the most powerful woman in the world was still very much a creature of her time. In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where towering ceilings echoed with the whispers of empire and gas lamps flickered against gilded walls, cleanliness for Queen Victoria took on an entirely different meaning than what we understand today. It was not only about water and soap, or the number of baths taken in a week. For the monarch of the most powerful empire on earth, cleanliness was often a performance, a visible ritual of decency, discipline, and order that extended far beyond the bathtub. And one of its most elaborate expressions was found not in the washroom, but in her wardrobe. Queen Victoria changed her clothes not once, not twice, but several times a day. To the modern mind, this might seem excessive or even luxurious, but in the 19th century, it was deeply entwined with the era's evolving ideas of hygiene, class, and propriety. Clothing was not merely a matter of fashion, it was a form of moral signaling, a reflection of cleanliness, not just of the body, but of the soul. To be clean was to be civilized, and to be civilized was to be clothed correctly at every hour, for every occasion, no matter how seemingly trivial. For Victoria, this meant beginning the day in a specific kind of morning dress, often lighter in fabric, plain in design, suited for private hours in her chamber or time with her children. Then would come the walking gown, or perhaps a riding habit if she were to take a morning trot. Later, perhaps a receiving dress, more formal, with structured bodices and high collars for afternoon tea or official duties. And in the evening, as chandeliers lit the palace halls and music filtered through the velvet-draped salons, she would don her grandest gowns, heavy with brocade, shimmering with embroidery, often adorned with jewels passed down through generations of royalty. And beneath every gown was a world of undergarments, more complex than the dresses themselves. Victoria's underlayers were not an afterthought. They were essential to the daily performance of royal cleanliness. The Queen's body was first clothed in linen chemises, changed regularly, sometimes multiple times a day, to absorb sweat and protect her outer garments from direct contact with her skin. These chemises were soft and breathable, but never seen, hidden beneath corsets, tightly laced to mold her figure to the beauty ideals of the day. A properly fitted corset was a symbol of discipline, a reminder that even the body must be restrained, civilized, and controlled. Over the corset came petticoats, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time, followed by hoops or crinolines in her younger years, and later the bustle, which reshaped the silhouette entirely. Then, finally, the gown itself. Each layer was an act of presentation. Each change throughout the day marked a transition from domestic woman to sovereign, from mother to monarch, from queen to widow and back again. To modern eyes, this might look like excessive vanity or aristocratic indulgence, but it was neither. For Queen Victoria, and for most of the upper-class Victorians, changing clothes was not about fashion so much as cleanliness and control. In an era when bathing was rare, changing into fresh garments was seen as a sanitary measure. Fabrics were believed to hold odors, to absorb the oils and secretions of the body, and so changing them regularly, especially those closest to the skin, was a logical substitute for frequent washing. If water could not always cleanse the body, then cotton, linen and lace would do the job in its place. Every fresh layer was a kind of silent purification, and in this sense, the royal wardrobe became a kind of second skin, a fabric boundary between the queen and the world, insulating her from disease, dirt and disorder. But this elaborate ritual of dress also depended on a small army of attendants. The queen did not dress herself, nor undress. Her wardrobe was tended by skilled maids and dressers, women who knew the complicated layers of court fashion like the back of their hands. Chief among them was the queen's personal dresser, a position of great trust and intimacy. This woman not only managed the clothing itself, but also helped Victoria into and out of each gown, laced her corsets, arranged her undergarments, and ensured that no pleat was out of place. She also kept meticulous records of each ensemble, what was worn, when, and with which accessories. So the queen would never be seen in the same dress twice at the wrong occasion. The garments themselves were stored in massive cedar-lined wardrobes, often catalogued and carefully maintained. Some of the most delicate items were aired after each use, hung by the fireplace to dry, brushed free of dust and body oil, then folded away in tissue paper until the next wearing. These clothes did not merely serve the queen, they surrounded her, shaped her, and in many ways defined her. And then there were the gloves. No Victorian lady, especially not the queen, would appear in society without them. Gloves were more than accessories, they were hygiene barriers. In a time when hand-washing was inconsistent and bacteria was barely understood, gloves kept the hands from direct contact with others, and thus from contamination. Queen Victoria's glove collection was legendary, tailored in soft kid leather, lined in silk, sometimes scented with lavender or rose. She wore them at formal events, religious ceremonies, and especially when receiving guests. In this too, there was a ritual. Gloves were removed in a particular order, folded just so, and often replaced midway through the day with a fresh pair. No detail was too small when it came to the performance of royal cleanliness. Interestingly, despite the changing political and technological landscape of her reign, Victoria remained deeply attached to these old customs. While her empire built railways across continents and strung telegraph wires over oceans, she clung to the idea that a clean camise, a fresh gown, and a perfumed glove could do more for a person's hygiene and moral standing than a modern shower ever could. There was comfort in routine, and safety in fabric, and perhaps most importantly, there was privacy. Unlike bathing, which required partial or total nudity, exposure to water, the assistance of maids, and often cold stone surroundings, changing clothes offered a sense of modesty, dignity, and control. It was a transformation done behind screens, in the hush of personal chambers, away from the eyes of even the most trusted servant. To dress and redress was to reassert order over the body, to restore the image of purity and respectability that the world expected of a queen. Yet this ritual of constant change came at a cost. Not just of time or labor, but of burden. The heavy fabrics, tight corsets, and endless layers were stifling in the summer months, and cumbersome in travel. Victoria herself often complained of the weight of her dresses, and in her later years preferred simpler gowns of black silk and lace, mourning the loss of her beloved Albert. Still, even in grief, the ritual remained. Even as her health declined, and the years passed her by, the layers continued, less elaborate, perhaps, but no less important. For even as the world outside marched toward modernity, Victoria's sense of cleanliness remained stitched into the seams of tradition. And in this, she was not alone. The Victorians, as a whole, held tightly to the idea that external appearances were the true measure of inner morality. A clean collar meant a clean conscience. A fresh petticoat reflected a well-ordered soul. Dirt, on the other hand, was associated not just with disease, but with disorder, chaos, and moral failure. And so, for women especially, clothing became armor, a shield against the grime of the city, the whispers of gossip, and the gaze of judgment. For Queen Victoria, whose every move was scrutinized, whose life was public even in its most private moments, this shield was all the more essential. Her wardrobe, then, was not merely a collection of gowns, gloves, and hats. It was a philosophy, a belief that through discipline of the body, one could achieve cleanliness of spirit. And while she may not have bathed every day, she clothed herself in cleanliness. Fresh linens, perfumed handkerchiefs, starched collars, and spotless gloves became her rituals of purification. In an age when the science of hygiene was still uncertain, and water itself was seen as both cure and threat, these layers of fabric became the Queen's quiet rebellion against decay and disorder. They were her way of staying clean, not just in body, but in the eyes of God, country, and history. In urban areas like London, public bathhouses began to emerge, often funded by philanthropic organizations. These establishments charged a small fee and offered working-class people a chance to bathe in a clean environment. Yet even with these options, usage was limited by time, money, and cultural reluctance. A similar hesitance was observed in royal circles, where age-old customs clashed with new scientific theories. Queen Victoria, always conservative in nature, tended to side with tradition. It wasn't until much later, as modern plumbing became widespread and antiseptic theories gained ground, that frequent bathing became normalized in British society. But during most of her reign, the Queen's infrequent bathing would not have raised eyebrows, not in her court, and not among her people. It's also worth noting that in the Victorian imagination, cleanliness was tied deeply to morality. The popular adage, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," reflected more about one's soul than one's hygiene. Clean clothes, polished shoes, and proper posture were seen as indicators of moral uprightness. The Queen, with her rigid adherence to routine, propriety, and moral conduct, embodied this ideal. To be clean was to be proper, respectable, and disciplined, values that were far more visible in public behavior and appearance than in the private act of washing. This context helps explain why Queen Victoria's hygiene habits, as surprising as they may seem today, were not just culturally acceptable but admired. For the average Victorian, bathing was a luxury, not a necessity. It was planned, deliberate, and often ritualistic. Queen Victoria's bathing routine, although supported by royal infrastructure, was subject to the same beliefs and constraints. Her bathtubs may have been made of copper or porcelain, and her towels may have been warmed by the hearth, but the underlying fear of drafts, the caution against waterborne illness, and the emphasis on dry cleanliness were concerns shared across social strata. The Queen was not so much leading the nation in hygiene practices, as she was participating in a shared cultural moment, one defined by suspicion of water, trust in fabric, and a complex dance between appearance and purity. In many ways, this shared hesitance toward bathing reveals the profound influence of societal norms on individual behavior, regardless of class. Queen Victoria, with all her power and privilege, still adhered to the habits of her time. She bathed rarely, trusted her appearance to convey cleanliness, and relied on her staff to maintain a routine that emphasized modesty, warmth, and discretion. Just like the common people of her realm, she existed in a world where the body was something to be preserved, protected, and occasionally purified, but not submerged and scrubbed as we do today. And that reality, perhaps more than any royal spectacle, brings her closer to the people she ruled. While historical records offer a glimpse into the public life of Queen Victoria, it is in her letters and diaries where the most intimate and candid details emerge, details that cast a revealing light on her relationship with personal hygiene and the rituals surrounding it. Queen Victoria was a prolific writer, composing thousands of letters and filling volumes of personal diaries over her long life. These writings, often intensely private, were not initially intended for public consumption, and as such, they carry a rawness and honesty that provide a unique window into her day-to-day experiences. Among her notes about politics, family, and royal duties, we find scattered but telling entries regarding her views on bathing, her discomfort with cold water, and the general inconvenience that hygiene seemed to represent in her life. Contrary to the popular image of monarchs enjoying every luxury, Victoria's own words show that the simple act of getting clean was far from a pleasurable indulgence. In one diary entry dated during her early reign, Queen Victoria noted, "Tried to bathe this morning, but the water was dreadfully cold, and the room not warmed. I felt most unwell after." Such entries reveal not only her dislike of the physical sensations involved, but also the lack of basic amenities, even in a royal household, that would ensure a warm, comfortable bath. Heating water for baths in the 19th century was a time-consuming process, involving heavy buckets carried from downstairs boilers to her chamber by servants. In the cold English climate, and in draughty palaces like Windsor and Balmoral, even the idea of stepping into tepid water could feel more like a punishment than a refreshment. Victoria, in her own words, often saw bathing as a burdensome task, tolerated more for duty than desire. In another letter, written to her daughter Princess Vicky, the Queen recounts an incident after one of her ceremonial events. "After the levee, I was greatly fatigued, and Lady Churchill insisted I should sponge off. The water was not agreeable. It gave me a chill that I have not quite shaken." Here we see not only the resistance she had to post-event hygiene, but also the deep belief common in the Victorian era that chills could bring on grave illness. This fear was not unfounded by contemporary medical standards. At the time, many still subscribed to the miasma theory, which suggested that disease was spread through bad air, and it was believed that opening the pores through hot water could make one more susceptible to catching these harmful airs. Bathing, therefore, was something to be approached cautiously, especially in colder months, and even Queen Victoria was not immune to this pervasive fear. Victoria's diary further reflects how bathing was often secondary to comfort and health concerns. In one reflective entry during her time at Balmoral, she wrote, "The air is so pure here, and the water so terribly cold, that I have avoided my bath again this week." Brown, her attendant, was concerned, "But I am no worse for it." This nonchalance toward skipping a full bath highlights how different the perception of cleanliness was in her time. The Queen was not being negligent or rebellious. She was simply conforming to the standards and expectations of hygiene typical among the upper classes of her era. Personal care was more about maintaining decorum than adhering to a rigid bathing schedule, and as long as she appeared neat and wore fresh garments, her hygiene was considered adequate. On occasion, Victoria also expressed her irritation with the ritualistic nature of her cleaning process. She once wrote, "The maids insist on oils and perfumes, which I find overbearing. I prefer lavender, lightly." This small preference reveals not only her modesty, but also her desire to avoid the overwhelming artificiality that sometimes came with luxury. The perfumes used at court were often dense and heavy, designed to cover any bodily odors from infrequent washing. Yet Victoria's dislike for strong scents suggests that she found such cover-ups unnecessary or even offensive. Her remarks here offer a humanizing glimpse into a queen who, though surrounded by grandeur, had simple preferences and occasional frustrations. Interestingly, Victoria sometimes mentioned the ritual of being sponged off by her maid, a common substitute for full bathing in her routine. In a particularly detailed entry, she describes, "My dear Annie, her lady's maid, was most attentive this morning. The sponge was warm, and she did not rush. It is quite agreeable when done with care." This passage offers rare warmth toward the process, emphasizing how the experience could be pleasant if managed gently and respectfully. The mention of warmth again highlights how crucial temperature and comfort were to her acceptance of any form of bathing. Moreover, this kind of entry illustrates the intimate relationship she held with her lady's maid, who was often responsible for helping her with nearly every physical aspect of cleanliness, from drawing the bathwater to drying her off. These moments, though practical in nature, were personal and required a degree of trust, especially given the Queen's strong sense of modesty and privacy. Victoria also confided occasional embarrassment in her writings when personal care was rushed or mishandled by staff. In a letter not long after the birth of one of her children, she lamented, "The nurse had arranged for a bath, but I felt terribly exposed. Even in my state it was not pleasant. I much prefer the privacy of my own chamber and Annie's hand." This reveals how the presence of too many attendants or medical staff during hygiene routines could be distressing to her. Modesty, particularly after childbirth, was an especially strong cultural value in Victorian times, and Victoria felt this intensely. Despite being a monarch, she craved the dignity of discretion and was often uneasy when her boundaries were crossed, even unintentionally. Moreover, her writings occasionally reflect a symbolic, almost ceremonial view of bathing. After a period of mourning for Prince Albert, Victoria noted, "Today I allowed myself to be sponged off fully, for the first time in weeks. It felt like a small release from the sorrow." Here, cleanliness took on a deeper, almost spiritual function. It marked a transition, a soft step away from the shadows of grief. Such references reinforce that for the Queen, bathing was never just a hygienic act. It could represent a form of renewal, a reintroduction to the world after a spell of withdrawal or illness. There are also humorous notes sprinkled throughout her letters regarding bathing mishaps. In a letter to her daughter Alice, she wrote, "Poor Dash, her beloved spaniel, leapt into the tub and startled the maid dreadfully. I nearly laughed aloud, though she did not." This rare bit of levity offers a charming look at how even the Queen's bathing rituals were not always solemn or structured. The presence of pets, children, or interruptions sometimes brought a dose of unpredictability, making the routine all the more relatable. Despite the decorum of royal life, the Queen encountered the same disruptions that any person might, and found amusement in them when possible. Over time, her attitude toward bathing evolved slightly. In her later years, as indoor plumbing and heating improved, she wrote less frequently about discomfort and more about the routines themselves. However, the entries never become glowing endorsements of frequent washing. Even as late as the 1890s, Victoria would mention her preference for sponge baths, and only rare immersions in a tub. The consistency of her remarks over decades confirms that her minimal approach to bathing was not due to poor health or inconvenience alone. It was a reflection of ingrained habits and cultural norms that lasted a lifetime. When reading her personal writings, one cannot help but sense that Queen Victoria's relationship with bathing was complex. It was shaped by practicality, health fears, modesty, emotional associations, and a deep aversion to discomfort. Her reluctance wasn't laziness or neglect. It was the prevailing mindset of her time, magnified by her personal values. Through her letters and diaries, we witness a monarch who, while cloaked in ceremony and tradition, wrestled with the same bodily routines as anyone else, and occasionally grumbled about them just the same. Ultimately, these private accounts remind us that royalty did not equate to constant pampering or luxury. Bathing was not a daily indulgence but a carefully considered event, sometimes avoided, sometimes endured, and only occasionally enjoyed. Queen Victoria's writings do not reveal a woman obsessed with physical cleanliness, but rather someone grounded in her era's beliefs, shaped by its fears, and guided by her own comfort and sense of dignity. In these glimpses of vulnerability and routine, we discover the humanity behind the crown, one that sweated, shivered, and sighed like the rest of us. In the prim and proper world of Victorian England, cleanliness meant something very different from what we know today. For Queen Victoria, and those in her court, soap and water were not the first line of defense against body odor. Instead, they relied heavily on scents, perfumes, oils, floral waters, and fragrant powders. In fact, these were not just accessories to their hygiene routine, they were the hygiene routine. Bathing was irregular, and often considered risky to health. So rather than scrub the body with soap, the goal became masking any natural odors with as many pleasant fragrances as possible. A person didn't necessarily have to be clean, but they absolutely had to smell clean, or better yet, divine. In this world of elaborate fashion, social class, and courtly rituals, Queen Victoria embodied the era's values with her own practices, and in her case, a cloud of rose-scented mist was far preferable to a tub full of water. The Queen's extensive perfume collection was a royal affair in itself. Imported from France, Italy, and various corners of the British Empire, her oils and scents were chosen with care, and often matched to the season or the occasion. Lavenders in spring, heavier musks and sandalwood in the winter months. Each fragrance carried its own identity, creating an invisible but very real part of Victoria's royal presence. She had a preference for subtle floral scents, rosewater being one of her favorites. Rather than sharp or overpowering perfumes, she gravitated toward gentle infusions that clung to the skin and the layers of fabric she wore throughout the day. These scents became part of her persona and were applied to handkerchiefs, gloves, and even undergarments. They lingered in the palace corridors long after she had left a room, offering a fragrant trail of royalty more telling than her footsteps. Perfumes were not applied in the ways we use them today. There were no spray bottles or atomizers. Instead, perfume came in tiny glass vials or ornamental jars, and was carefully dabbed behind ears, at the wrists or on the neckline. Sometimes these oils were mixed with powdered starch, and gently rubbed onto the body using silk cloths. Powders infused with floral notes were also applied to the skin, not only for the scent, but also for the way they absorbed moisture and reduced shine. Queen Victoria, like many elite women of her time, would often dust her body with these scented powders after a sponge bath, or even without any bathing at all. It was a daily habit, a kind of dry cleansing ritual that left one smelling and feeling refreshed, without touching a drop of water. Even the clothing she wore contributed to this scented barrier. Multiple layers of petticoats, corsets, slips, and gowns acted as both insulation and protection. Between the skin and the outer world lay a fortress of fabric, each layer absorbing and then holding the perfumes and powders applied earlier. Over time, the scent would fade, so it had to be reapplied daily, and sometimes more than once a day. Maids were tasked not just with dressing the queen, but also with ensuring that her undergarments and gowns were adequately perfumed. Scented sachets were sewn into the linings of her dresses. Drawers were filled with lavender sachets or bars of perfumed wax. Even gloves and fans were gently treated with essential oils. In this royal atmosphere, fragrance wasn't an afterthought, it was embedded in every layer of life. But it wasn't just about the luxury of smelling nice. In an age when the germ theory of disease had not yet become widely accepted, many Victorians believed that foul smells were the cause of illness. This belief, known as the miasma theory, held that disease was spread by bad air, so to surround oneself with pleasant scents was, in essence, a kind of protection. Queen Victoria herself, like many others, believed that wearing sweet-smelling oils helped keep her healthy. Rooms were fumigated with lavender and eucalyptus. Potpourri sat in bowls on side tables. Candles and incense were chosen for their aromatic properties. Even during travel, she made sure her handkerchiefs and carriage interiors were perfumed. It was not only a matter of comfort, but of perceived safety. If it smelled clean, it was clean, at least to the Victorian mind. Interestingly, the Queen's reliance on fragrance was not limited to her personal body. Even her court furniture and linens were subjected to the royal scenting rituals. Her bed linens were often washed with rosewater, and her pillows lightly sprinkled with violet essence. Maids would air out the royal chambers each morning, and then reintroduce fragrance into the room with scented cloths or bowls of herbs. In a world where windows often stayed closed due to weather or fear of illness, maintaining a pleasant-smelling environment was paramount. And for Queen Victoria, who spent hours in her private writing rooms, drawing rooms, and personal chambers, this olfactory management created a bubble of comfort, an invisible barrier against the unclean world. Of course, one cannot ignore the symbolism behind all of this. In Victorian society, scent was more than a sensory experience. It was a social signal. To smell good was to be civilized, refined, and morally upright. Body odor, on the other hand, was associated with poverty, labor, and lack of self-control. Queen Victoria, as the highest figure in the land, embodied the ideal of purity and restraint, and her fragrance regime was part of that larger image. By surrounding herself with sweetness, she distanced herself from the earthy realities of common life. Scents became a way to maintain dignity, even when the body itself was not technically clean. It's not surprising then that she rarely wrote about bathing in her journals, but often noted her preferences for certain perfumes or the comforting ritual of applying lavender oils before bed. There were moments, however, when the limitations of this system showed, during long travels or in times of illness. Victoria occasionally commented on feeling unclean or uncomfortable, despite the layers of fragrance. In one diary entry, she mentioned being irritated by the stale smell of old powders after a week without bathing. In another, she wrote about craving the coolness of real water after a long summer journey. These rare glimpses show that, while scent could cover a great deal, it was not always a perfect substitute for cleanliness. Yet these moments were fleeting, and more often than not, she returned to her trusted routine of oils and powders with contentment. The culture around scents also extended to the larger world of etiquette and courtly expectation. When foreign dignitaries visited Buckingham Palace, there were unwritten codes regarding fragrance. It was expected that visitors would come properly scented, not overpoweringly, but delicately so. Perfume was part of one's attire, as essential as gloves or a hat. The royal court had a nose for these things, and those who arrived unscented, or worse, smelling of sweat or tobacco, were often looked down upon. In this olfactory world, the ability to manage one's scent became a marker of status, refinement, and education. By the end of Queen Victoria's reign, the rise of new medical knowledge began to shift public attitudes toward bathing and hygiene. Soap manufacturing improved, plumbing systems evolved, and frequent bathing gradually became more accessible. But for most of her life, Victoria maintained the traditions she had grown up with: sponge baths, warm towels, fragrant oils, and layers upon layers of beautifully scented garments. Even as doctors and scientists began to speak about germs and cleanliness, the Queen remained loyal to the age-old belief that a pleasant scent was the best sign of health and virtue. Today, her habits might seem strange or even unsanitary, but within the context of her time, they were normal, even aspirational. Victorian society was not built on sterilized surfaces and antibacterial soap, but on the poetry of petals, the comfort of clove, and the luxury of lavender. Queen Victoria's fragrant world was as much about identity as it was about hygiene. Every scented ribbon, every perfumed glove, every vial on her vanity told a story, not just of a queen, but of an era where smelling right meant everything. It was a silent language of elegance, one that wafted through corridors, lingered on gowns, and said more about a person than words ever could. Throughout the 19th century, Queen Victoria's court stood as a global symbol of grandeur, etiquette, and unmatched formality. With its shimmering gowns, meticulously timed ceremonies, and strict social codes, it radiated an image of power and order to the rest of the world. Yet, for many foreign dignitaries and royal visitors, there was a rather curious, often unsettling contrast between the grandeur of the British court and the personal hygiene practices that lay beneath its surface. At the heart of this quiet surprise was the Victorian approach to cleanliness, particularly the rather infrequent bathing habits of not just the Queen, but of her entire royal household. To the British, cleanliness meant a combination of social decorum, elegant clothing, and sweet-smelling perfumes. But to guests from other parts of Europe and beyond, especially from countries where daily bathing was beginning to gain traction, the absence of regular washing seemed at times astonishing. Several documented accounts, journals, and letters written by foreign emissaries during visits to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle reveal a quiet bewilderment at the British idea of clean. While Queen Victoria was seen as dignified and morally upright, her bathing habits were no different from those of the average upper-class Briton of the time, which meant she may have bathed only once a week, or even less frequently during certain seasons. To guests from countries such as France, Russia, or even some parts of Scandinavia, where the concept of regular bathing had taken stronger root due to the influence of spa towns, hot springs, and a more developed culture of public bathhouses, this lack of frequent washing seemed contradictory to the regal image the Queen projected. These dignitaries expected the seat of the British Empire to set the highest standards in all things, including personal hygiene, but instead, they often found themselves holding their breath, quite literally, as they exchanged formal pleasantries with members of a court that emphasized appearance and fragrance over soap and water. Queen Victoria's court was nothing if not proper. Every gesture was rehearsed, every word chosen with precision, and every item of dress selected to reflect the majesty of the monarchy. However, this surface perfection sometimes masked what foreign visitors considered unsavory realities. Lavish balls were held in grand halls, illuminated by chandeliers, where layers of perfume floated through the air like invisible curtains. But the truth behind those floral scents was a world that had yet to fully embrace modern hygiene. Underneath the laces, velvets, and corsets were bodies that had not touched water in days, perhaps even weeks. For some foreign observers, especially those attuned to the newer European ideals of daily cleanliness, this contradiction between surface elegance and physical hygiene was both fascinating and jarring. It wasn't just the infrequency of bathing that caught foreign eyes. It was the entire ritual surrounding cleanliness, or rather the absence of it. Guests from countries like France, where perfumes had once served the same purpose during earlier centuries, but where daily washing was increasingly becoming the norm, found the British reliance on powders and scented oils to be an outdated approach. Queen Victoria herself preferred delicate floral waters, rose oils, and lavender-based fragrances to mask body odor, a method considered more refined in British culture than the raw use of water. In contrast, French guests, increasingly exposed to innovations in plumbing and public hygiene campaigns, viewed bathing as not just a matter of cleanliness but of health and modernity. The divergence in attitudes was subtle yet profound, and it left many foreign visitors both intrigued and at times disappointed. Eastern European dignitaries, particularly those from Russian courts where bathhouses or banyas were a central part of culture, also expressed subtle shock. In Russia, steaming, scrubbing, and regular washing were linked not just to hygiene but to spirituality and wellness. When Russian visitors entered the halls of British royalty, they found a court that was ceremonially polished yet physically aloof from the ritual of regular bathing. For them, the British court's emphasis on scent and wardrobe felt more like a theatrical performance than a commitment to cleanliness. And while few would ever dare voice their concerns publicly, out of respect or diplomacy, private correspondences reveal a quiet wonder at how a civilization so advanced in politics, literature, and empire building could remain so traditional, even regressive, in matters of the body. Interestingly, some foreign dignitaries were more forgiving. Visitors from countries where similar hygiene customs still prevailed, such as parts of rural Austria or Italy, found the British royal habits somewhat familiar, if still outdated. These individuals often remarked not on the bathing practices themselves, but on the elaborate rituals the British had created to mask their bodily realities. Layers upon layers of fabric, scented handkerchiefs tucked into gloved hands, perfumed hair powders, and frequent wardrobe changes, all these were considered sufficient substitutes for soap and water. To those visitors, the British commitment to external presentation, even if it skipped a few practical steps, was a cultural phenomenon worthy of admiration, if not imitation. Some of the more open-minded guests sought to understand the deeper reasons behind this approach. They noted the climate, cold, damp, and often unfriendly to large tubs of lukewarm water, and the architectural limitations of British homes and palaces. many of which lacked dedicated bathrooms even well into the 19th century. Plumbing systems were still evolving, and drawing a bath required an army of servants, buckets of heated water, and an entire afternoon of preparation. It wasn't that the British were lazy or unaware, rather, their entire concept of bathing had evolved within a framework of tradition, practicality, and deeply rooted cultural habits. To foreign guests, once this was understood, the peculiarities of the British court's hygiene practices began to make more sense. That said, humour and mild criticism did find their way into letters and anecdotes. One amusing tale involved a French noblewoman who was shocked to find no proper bathhouse at her guest quarters in London. Expecting a marble tub and servants with scented towels, she was instead handed a ceramic basin and a jug of lukewarm water, enough to freshen up, she was told. Her diary recounts the episode with polite sarcasm, noting how the English preferred perfume to purity and joking that perhaps the scent of lavender was stronger than the smell of soap. Similar accounts, some gentle, some biting, have been recorded in letters from visiting German counts, Ottoman envoys, and even American industrialists, all of whom struggled to reconcile the image of an all-powerful empire with its modest approach to bodily care. It's worth noting that Queen Victoria herself was not immune to foreign commentary. While she fiercely protected her privacy, her court was aware of whispers and remarks from foreign guests. Occasionally reforms were proposed: better facilities, more frequent washing, and improved ventilation in royal quarters. But tradition was hard to overcome. The Queen was a creature of habit, raised in a world where the body was considered something to be veiled, not exposed. The Victorian fear of catching cold, especially from dampness, also played a role. Many believed that too much bathing could weaken the body or invite illness. To change such beliefs required more than the quiet disapproval of outsiders. It required a cultural shift, one that would only take root in the years following Victoria's reign. Still, not all reactions were negative. Some guests admired the grace and resilience of the British court. They saw Queen Victoria's modesty, restraint, and adherence to tradition as virtues, not flaws. To them, her bathing habits, or lack thereof, were simply another reflection of a deeply held commitment to propriety, humility, and ritual. In a world where appearances mattered more than perspiration, and where moral virtue was linked to control of the flesh, perhaps the Queen's avoidance of daily bathing was, in its own way, a silent declaration of dignity. In the end, the reaction of foreign dignitaries to Queen Victoria's hygiene habits reveals a fascinating tension between cultural perception and personal ritual. It highlights how cleanliness, like so many aspects of human life, is not simply about soap or water. It is shaped by history, geography, values, and belief. While Queen Victoria's court may not have matched modern standards of hygiene, it upheld a code of conduct that was equally powerful in its time. And though some guests left puzzled or amused, they could not deny the elegance, order, and symbolic grandeur that defined the heart of the British Empire. Clean or not, Queen Victoria's presence left a mark, one scented with rose oil, wrapped in lace, and bound in tradition. Even long after Queen Victoria's reign ended, her influence lingered like the scent of rosewater in the halls of British royalty. Her habits, those rituals of cleanliness tinged with modesty, ceremony, and a distinct air of controlled decorum, did not end with her. They were passed down, inherited like fine bone china, or the pages of a family Bible, etched into the daily lives of her children and their descendants. For Queen Victoria, cleanliness had never been merely about scrubbing away grime or immersing in steaming baths. It was a deeply personal yet outwardly rigid performance of virtue and propriety. This performance, by the time her children matured into their own roles as monarchs, consorts, and aristocrats, had become a royal tradition. Her daughters in particular seemed to carry the torch most faithfully, upholding the moral codes, wardrobe rituals, and bathing customs of their mother not out of simple loyalty, but as a matter of expected identity. To be royal, after Victoria, meant to be meticulously covered, privately washed, and modest in all things related to the body. Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's second daughter, was perhaps one of the clearest examples of this inherited mindset. Raised in an atmosphere where physicality and emotional vulnerability were to be managed with discretion, Alice developed an acute sense of duty and personal restraint. Her letters show a woman who prioritized order, cleanliness, and moral uprightness. Often at the expense of ease or comfort, she too maintained a measured approach to bathing, sparse, efficient, and mostly symbolic. She favored washing parts of the body, rather than full immersion, and emphasized the use of cloths, scented waters, and the ever-present modesty-preserving undergarments. For Alice, as it had been for her mother, cleanliness was next to godliness, but not necessarily synonymous with the daily scrubbing modern audiences might expect. Princess Helena, another daughter of the Queen, also mirrored her mother's views. She too upheld the layered clothing systems, and understood that the number of wardrobe changes per day was not vanity, it was virtue. Just as Queen Victoria had seen the act of changing undergarments and gowns as a form of cleanliness in itself, so too did her daughters internalize that keeping the skin from contact with visible sweat was more important than regular bathing. Victorian cleanliness was often more textile than water. In royal circles, to be clean was to smell of lavender or rose oil, to wear fresh chemises, and to ensure that your corsets were aired and dried in front of the fireplace before being laced tightly again the next morning. Queen Victoria's sons inherited different yet similarly shaped beliefs. Prince Edward, the future Edward VII, famously rebelled in many aspects of royal decorum, yet even he absorbed his mother's attitudes toward the ritual of appearance and bodily maintenance. While he became associated with a more hedonistic lifestyle as an adult, the early impressions left by his mother's stringent domestic codes never quite faded. He maintained a fastidious wardrobe, travelled with a personal valet who managed an elaborate rotation of garments, and was rarely seen in public without meticulous grooming. Even when the standards of personal hygiene began to shift toward modern understandings, like regular bathing, soap use and plumbing, Edward's habits still echoed the old world. Cleanliness remained a matter of reputation and control, rather than biological necessity. Other children of Queen Victoria, especially those married into European dynasties, carried these beliefs abroad. Princess Victoria, who married into the Prussian royal family, brought with her a British sense of cleanliness, layered in modesty, heavy fabrics, perfumes, and the absolute avoidance of impropriety. She became an influential figure in German court life, and although the Prussians had their own customs, Victoria's presence inevitably transported some of the British Empire's ideals with her. Even in her letters, she would echo her mother's tone, chiding herself or others for revealing too much skin, worrying about the moral implications of bathing customs, and speaking reverently of scented oils and fire-warmed towels. What Queen Victoria began in her own quiet way, a deeply ritualized symbolic relationship with cleanliness, grew into a generational practice. For decades after her death in 1901, the royal household still reflected her principles. Bathrooms remained rare in the private chambers of palaces. Portable tubs continued to be wheeled into rooms and filled by servants. Gowns were changed several times daily, with each change considered a renewal of hygiene. Underwear was changed frequently, sometimes multiple times in a single day, and perfumes were still preferred over excessive washing. Despite the introduction of indoor plumbing and the eventual embrace of modern soap, the Victorian tradition held firm in the upper echelons of court life. Even Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned over a century after Victoria's birth, inherited aspects of these habits, though modernized. The emphasis on grooming, on appearance, and on being presentable in all circumstances did not originate with her, but was deeply rooted in the traditions handed down from Victoria's age. The Queen was never seen dishevelled or improperly dressed, and her personal routines, though adapted to the 20th century, echoed with the same precision and reserve that Victoria had championed. Elizabeth's legendary punctuality and tightly managed schedule bore the stamp of Victorian discipline. But Queen Victoria's influence was not only visible in practice, it was also embedded in attitude. Her emphasis on modesty, privacy, and control left an imprint on the emotional culture of the monarchy. To this day, royals are often described as reserved, stoic, and dignified, particularly in contrast to the emotional transparency of the modern world. This emotional reserve, this carefully managed presentation of self, began in earnest with Victoria. For her to show vulnerability or indulgence was a risk, one that could weaken the throne or encourage scandal. Cleanliness, in her view, was tied to moral uprightness, and moral uprightness was the bedrock of monarchy. Her children understood this, and many internalized it even when the world outside was changing rapidly. As the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian, and eventually to the post-war world, much of society moved on. Plumbing improved, bathtubs became a fixture of middle-class homes, daily washing became standard, and the scent of soap overtook the old perfume-laden air. But inside the walls of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, echoes of Queen Victoria still whispered through the chambers. Her sense of duty, her strict schedule, her belief that being clean meant being worthy, all of it lingered. It's said that tradition is the heartbeat of monarchy, and few traditions beat more steadily than those Queen Victoria set in motion. Even today, the rituals continue. Royal staff still press garments daily, ensuring no wrinkles betray the regal silhouette. Scented oils and lotions are still used, if now more for luxury than necessity. Public appearance is still governed by the same discipline. Hats worn at angles that nod to Victorian modesty, gloves on hands that may never touch the common crowd, posture that says more about upbringing than it does about comfort. And while Queen Victoria's bathtub may now be a museum relic, her ideas about cleanliness, presentation, and symbolic purity are not. They live on in every carefully staged royal portrait, in every gloved handshake, in every whispered anecdote about a royal dressing room. They live in the gowns worn for coronations and jubilees, layered in silks and satins that nod to her era. They live in the invisible, unspoken rules that guide how a modern-day princess carries herself, or how a prince must present himself during public mourning. In many ways, her beliefs outlived even her bloodline, becoming a standard not just for royals, but for the idea of what it means to be royal. In the end, Queen Victoria's legacy was not just political or imperial, it was personal. It was in the way she bathed, the way she dressed, and the way she taught her children to do the same. Her influence traveled beyond borders, beyond generations, beyond even the logical boundaries of time. And while historians may now look back with amusement or even criticism at her symbolic approach to cleanliness, the truth remains, she changed the monarchy not just through laws or lineage, but through the intimate, quiet rituals of daily life. Cleanliness, to Queen Victoria, was not just about hygiene, it was about heritage, and it is that very heritage that still lingers, quiet, perfumed and tightly laced, in the corridors of power she once called home. In the quiet, candlelit corners of Windsor Castle, or the solemn stillness of Balmoral's halls, one might be tempted to view Queen Victoria as more myth than woman. Towering paintings and stiff portraits immortalize her as a figure of great power, unwavering authority, and stoic resolve. But as we draw the curtain on her bathing rituals and personal habits, something else gently emerges from the steam and lace, a portrait not of a monarch draped in velvet, but of a woman with her own preferences, routines, discomforts, and curiosities. Stripped of crown and scepter, Queen Victoria reminds us that even history's most iconic figures lived lives surprisingly familiar in their quiet domestic details. She too had her aversions. Cold water. It crept into her bones and left her teeth chattering. She once penned about it in her diary, not with outrage or political fervor, but with the same kind of mild annoyance that any of us might feel when stepping into a frigid bath early in the morning. She detested the chill of it, the shock to the skin, the sharp contrast to her cozy bedclothes. This wasn't a grand declaration, merely a human reaction, one so ordinary that it draws her closer to us than all the royal decrees ever could. And yet, she persisted. Her bathing schedule, though not frequent by today's standards, was a testament to her discipline and dedication to modesty rather than comfort. Baths were not indulgent rituals of scented oils and warm towels, not the serene self-care routines we imagine today. They were necessary but restrained, controlled, almost reluctant. She bathed as required by decorum, not necessarily as desired by comfort. Her resistance to daily bathing wasn't an act of negligence. It was simply what the time demanded, what tradition dictated, and what she had always known. Her cleanliness was framed through the lens of Victorian morality, not modern microbiology. And what we see in this, more than anything, is that Victoria, the Empress of India, the sovereign over millions, was still a creature of habit, of circumstance, and of era. She was bound not only by corsets and ceremonial obligation, but also by the same societal norms that governed her subjects, though with a bit more lace, a few more petticoats, and a touch more discretion. Her world was one where perfumes masked the scent of unwashed skin, where changing gowns multiple times a day served more hygienic purposes than actual bathing, and where cleanliness was measured not by sterilization, but by propriety and polish. When we look at her routines, what becomes clear isn't that she was above reproach or untouchably regal, but rather that she was strikingly ordinary in certain ways. The absence of long, luxurious soaks, the presence of scented powders, the careful changing of linen and layers, it all points to a woman navigating the same discomforts and limitations that faced so many of her era. She might have had golden basins and perfumed towels, but she still shivered at the cold, still disliked the sting of chilly water, still relied on her attendants to prepare the bath just so. In those little habits, those seemingly trivial moments of daily life, we find the threads that stitch her legacy, not just to the throne, but to humanity. Yes, she ruled over an empire on which the sun never set, but she also disliked drafts. She fussed over water temperature, she preferred certain scents. She followed customs passed down by her mother, and then passed them on to her daughters. These aren't merely footnotes in a textbook, they're glimpses into a living, breathing person. Even her legacy, often remembered in terms of politics and empire, holds these personal echoes. Her children, brought up under the same expectations of modesty and ritual, carried those traditions forward. The gowns, the scents, the caution around exposure. These were more than rules. They were family rhythms, rituals of respectability, and perhaps in those rituals, Victoria found a sense of order, of control, in a life so often shaped by duty and spectacle. Her bath was not just a bath. It was a space carved out for reflection, for silence, for continuity. It's easy to judge the past with the sharp clarity of the present, to raise our eyebrows at infrequent bathing, or to cringe at the idea of covering odor rather than washing it away. But context is everything, and in her context, Queen Victoria was not behind the times. She was very much of her time. In fact, she represented the pinnacle of Victorian values: restraint, decorum, modesty, and moral hygiene. Her body may not have been scrubbed daily, but her image was maintained with precision. She was clean in the way the 19th century understood cleanliness, not through antibacterial soap, but through routine scent and garments. And so, as we reflect on the monarch behind the monarchy, what lingers is not just her political legacy, but her personal humanity. The woman who bore 9 children, mourned a beloved husband for decades, corresponded tirelessly with statesmen, and still took time to write about a bothersome bath. She emerges from history not just as a ruler, but as a person who was sometimes grumpy, sometimes fastidious, and sometimes tired of the cold. Perhaps that's the greatest gift of peering into these intimate details, that they dissolve the distance between us and her, between the 21st century viewer and the 19th century queen, because in the end, we all seek comfort. We all have routines. We all have things we like and dislike, rituals we follow, and habits that shape our days. And yes, even queens flinch at cold water. So let us remember Queen Victoria not just for her long reign, or her empire, or her famously stern expression. Let us remember her too, for the small things, the scent of her favorite powder, the warmth of the towel draped over her shoulders, the sigh at an ill-timed draft. Let us remember that history, no matter how grand, is made up of people, and that even the most powerful woman in the world was, in her own way, just like us, navigating daily life, managing discomfort, and trying, perhaps, to stay a little cleaner than yesterday.